Hello, my dear listeners of Night Stories. I'm glad you've started watching this video, and I wish you a pleasant experience with this new story. It's quite creepy and interesting, with many unknown and rather strange elements. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when I was studying this story, I got goosebumps, and I want you to feel the same. And what surprises me most is that the story isn't finished yet, and this is even more frightening, since it is still somewhere in the world. I want to inform you that all images have been added to help you better imagine the story itself, but they are not part of it. Enjoy. The chest beneath the eaves. I did not come upon the story deliberately. That detail matters, because had I been searching for it, I might later have convinced myself that I imagined what followed. But the truth is simpler and, for that reason, more disturbing. The story found me. The house where it began no longer exists. It stood once on the eastern edge of what is now a widened road, its foundations torn out and forgotten beneath gravel and rain. When I first learned of it, I was not even looking for houses, but for correspondence, private letters from rural England written between 1750 and 1780, the kind that never make their way into museums because they are too mundane, too personal, too small to be history. They were kept in a private archive, poorly catalogued, boxed, according to no logic I could discern. At the bottom of one such box, beneath tax receipts, and a sermon copied by an uncertain hand, no title, no author's name, only a date pressed faintly into the inside cover. 1761. At first glance, the entries appeared ordinary. Household notes, prayers half-written, and abandoned observations about the weather. It was only after several pages that another hand began to intrude, lighter, less disciplined, slanting upward as though resisting the authority of the lines. Its second hand belonged to a child. I would later learn her name was Elizabeth Harroway. The ledgers alone might not have held my attention for long. Children's writing from that period is not rare, and sentimentality often leads modern readers to find meaning where none exists. But folded carefully between the pages were letters, some unfinished, some never sent, written by 3 different people, all referring, in one way or another, to the same object, a doll. At first, the references were almost affectionate. Elizabeth has taken to the thing with uncommon devotion. Her mother wrote in one letter, the ink pressed hard enough to scar the paper. She calls it her quiet one, and will not sleep without it near. The phrase caught me. Quiet one. Not a name, not quite. More a description, or perhaps a reassurance. The next mention was less gentle. I do not care for how she watches, the father wrote, in a letter never signed. Would should not seem to listen. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. I remember closing the ledger and telling myself out loud, in the empty reading room, that people in the 18th century were prone to superstition. That language was more poetic then, less precise, and yet, even as I said it, I felt the familiar unease that comes when a rational explanation arrives too quickly, as though eager to bury something before it can be examined. I returned to the beginning and read more carefully. Elizabeth Harroway lived with her parents in the village of St. Albans Attic, the city as it exists now, but a small settlement several miles north, one that no longer appears on maps. Her father, Samuel, worked intermittently as a cooper. Her mother, Martha, kept the house and supplemented their income by mending clothes for neighbors. There is no record of wealth, nor of exceptional hardship. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable people, which is often how these stories begin. The doll entered their lives in late autumn. There is no receipt, no bill of sale, only a brief mention in Martha's hand, She was made by Agnes Fell. That name, unlike the others, was not unfamiliar to me. Agnes Fell appears several times in parish records from the period, usually accompanied by marginal notes written later and in darker ink. Questioned, observed, removed from village census. Agnes Fell lived alone at the edge of the woods, far enough that smoke from her chimney could be mistaken for fog. She was a maker of small things, buttons carved from bone, toys whittled from scraps of wood, charms that were said to ward off illness. Such women were tolerated when times were easy and feared when they were not. Elizabeth's doll was one of Agnes's creations. According to the child's writing, it was given to her without ceremony. No wrapping, no warning. She fits in my arms like she belongs there, Elizabeth wrote. Her hair smells old. There is a pause in the diary after that entry. Several pages torn out, removed with care rather than haste. When the writing resumes, the tone has changed. Mother says, I must not speak of what the doll says back to me. The first time I read that line, I assumed metaphor. Children speak to toys. Toys, in turn, speak back in imagined voices. It is a universal fiction of childhood, harmless and transient. But Elizabeth does not describe imagination. She records conversations. Not word for word at first, but impressions. She is quieter than me. She knows things from before. She does not like when father prays too loud. It is tempting, reading these lines, to diagnose from a distance, to see in them loneliness or rebellion, or the beginnings of a mind straining against confinement. But then the letters intrude again, breaking the illusion that this is merely a child's interior world. Martha writes to her sister, "The doll is never where I leave it." Samuel writes to no one, perhaps only to himself. I moved it from the stair. In the morning, it was back, facing the door. There is a peculiar consistency to these complaints. No hysteria, no dramatic language, only confusion, repeated often enough that it begins to sound like fear restrained by habit. The last entry before winter is brief. She says the house remembers her. I closed the ledger at that point, unsettled in a way that had little to do with belief. What troubled me was not the suggestion of something unnatural, but the steadiness of the narrative. There was no single moment of rupture, no clear descent into madness, only a gradual adjustment, as though everyone involved had accepted a new rule of the world without ever agreeing to it. In the margin of that final page, written in an adult hand I could not yet identify, was a single sentence. After this, the father is no longer mentioned. I would not understand what that meant until much later. For now, it was enough to know that the doll had entered the house quietly, without announcement, and that nothing in the Harroways' lives had been the same since, and that, according to every remaining record, it had never left the village that would not speak. St. Albans, as Elizabeth knew it, was not a place of roads and signs, but of paths worn into the earth by repetition. The houses stood apart from one another, not out of planning, but caution, as if each family preferred a little distance in which to keep its secrets. Wood darkened by rain, stones softened by moss. Nothing new, nothing eager. Elizabeth wrote about the village rarely, and when she did, it was with the detached certainty of a child who believes the world has always been arranged exactly as she finds it. People were not described by temperament, but by habit. Mrs. Calder smelled of onions. Old Hugh limped, and never finished his sentences. Agnes Fell lived where the trees grew too close together. Agnes was spoken of differently. Children were warned not to wander near the wood's edge, though no reason was ever given that satisfied them. Adults lowered their voices when her name surfaced, as though volume itself might attract misfortune. Elizabeth noted this, without comment, only observing once that Agnes listened better than most people. The doll came from that listening woman. According to Martha's letter, Agnes arrived at the house just before dusk, unannounced. She did not knock. She waited. When Martha opened the door, Agnes stood with her hands folded, the doll resting against her skirts as if it were capable of holding itself upright. No price was asked. Agnes addressed Elizabeth directly, kneeling with a stiffness that suggested pain rather than age. She placed the doll into the child's arms and said only, "She remembers being held." That sentence appears in no fewer than 3 accounts, identical in wording. It was remembered because it was strange, and because none of them understood it at the time. Elizabeth's first description of the doll is careful, almost reverent. She does not describe its face all at once. Instead, she notices parts: the smoothness of the cheek, the weight of the head, the hair sewn in tightly, pulling at the wood beneath. "She is heavier than she should be," Elizabeth wrote. "Not heavy like stone, heavier like someone leaning." The village reacted as villages do, slowly and in fragments. Someone claimed Agnes had begun making toys again. Someone else said she should not be allowed near children. No one confronted her. Confrontation required certainty, and certainty was in short supply. The doll was seen, occasionally, when Elizabeth carried it outside. People remarked that it was well made, that it looked old-fashioned, that its eyes caught the light oddly. No one said they felt uncomfortable, though several later admitted they had shortened their visits to the Haraway house without knowing why. Winter arrived early that year. Snow fell before the ground had hardened, leaving the earth beneath soft and dark. Elizabeth's entries grow longer as the days shorten. She writes of staying indoors, of her father pacing, of her mother praying more often and with less patience, and always the doll. She sits where she can see the door. Elizabeth notes, she says it is polite. It is around this time that the child begins attributing preferences to it. Not demands, exactly. Opinions. The doll dislikes cold corners. It prefers not to face mirrors. It does not enjoy being left alone with Martha. Samuel's discomfort appears first as irritation. He complains of tripping over the doll on the stairs, of finding it placed on chairs he does not remember moving. He insists Elizabeth stop carrying it to the table. Martha agrees briefly, before relenting after a night of Elizabeth's quiet, relentless crying. There is no single incident that marks the village's turn against Agnes Fell. Rather, there is a gradual withdrawal. Fewer people pass her cottage. The path grows over. Smoke stops rising from her chimney for days at a time. Elizabeth writes one final thing about Agnes that winter. She does not listen anymore, she says. She is waiting. Waiting for what? Elizabeth does not know. She does not ask. Neither, it seems, does anyone else. Agnes Fell, and the weight of what remains. There is a tendency, when looking back on events like these, to imagine that fear announces itself clearly, that it arrives with raised voices, with certainty, with a collective turning of heads toward a single cause. The truth, at least in St. Albans, was far less dramatic. Fear arrived quietly. It arrived disguised as common sense. Agnes Fell had always lived apart from the village, and for years this separation had been framed as choice. She preferred the woods. She disliked company. She was odd, perhaps, but harmless. Such labels are useful because they allow people to avoid further thought. Once someone is declared harmless, no responsibility remains. Elizabeth's earliest mentions of Agnes are observational rather than emotional. Agnes is not feared nor admired. She simply exists. A woman at the edge of things. She knows when I am lying, Elizabeth wrote once. Without elaboration, she does not say so. She waits. Waiting is a recurring theme in Elizabeth's writing, though it takes a while to notice. First, it applies to objects. 10, 2, people. Ultimately, it seems to describe the house itself. Agnes made things. That much was known. Buttons, toys, small wooden animals for children whose parents could not afford better. She carved slowly, deliberately, and never repeated a design exactly. Elizabeth describes watching her work, fascinated by the way Agnes paused before each cut, as if listening for permission. She says the wood remembers being a tree, Elizabeth writes. If you rush, it hurts. In another context, such statements might be dismissed as quaint. In St. Albans, they began to feel like warnings. The parish records are sparse, but suggestive. Agnes missed services. She spoke rarely during gatherings. When she did, she asked questions no one wished to answer. Where does a thing go when it is no longer needed? Who decides when something is finished? The doll appears in these records only indirectly, never by name, never by description. But after its arrival, the tone changes. Complaints begin to surface. A neighbor reports finding a child's toy on her doorstep, though she has no children. Another claims that something wooden tapped against her window during the night. None of these statements are followed up. They are noted, and then allowed to sink beneath more pressing concerns. Elizabeth, meanwhile, grows increasingly attached to the doll. She writes of it as a companion, but also as an observer. Someone who notices what others overlook. She does not sleep, Elizabeth writes. She just closes her eyes to be polite. That sentence is underlined twice. Martha's letters reveal a growing strain within the household. She complains of restlessness, of prayers that feel unfinished, of dreams in which the house rearranges itself around her. She never mentions the doll directly in these passages, as if avoiding its name might lessen its influence. Samuel is less restrained. In one unsent letter, he writes, I have told the child to leave the thing downstairs. She says it becomes lonely. I am tired of being the only one who notices where it moves. This is the first clear admission of fear, and even then it is framed as irritation. Samuel does not claim the doll walks, or speaks, or acts with intention, only that it does not remain where it is placed. Only that it seems aware of threshold stairs, doors, corners, where one space becomes another. As winter deepens, the village begins to change its behavior. Toward Agnes, people stop greeting her. Children are cold inside when she passes. Someone nails a charm above their door, carved crudely from ash. Another burns one of Agnes's toys in their hearth and swears the smoke smelled wrong. Elizabeth writes of visiting Agnes less often, not because she is forbidden, but because Agnes herself seems distant. She listens to the woods now, Elizabeth notes, not to me. The turning point, if it can be called that, comes with the disappearance of a child from a neighboring settlement. The boy was last seen near the road that skirts the trees. No evidence linked Agnes to the event, but evidence was not what the village sought. They sought relief. Agnes was questioned by the parish elders. She answered carefully, choosing her words with a precision that was later used against her. When asked if she made likenesses of people, she replied that all dolls are likenesses of someone. When pressed further, she said only, "Nothing is made without leaving something behind." That phrase appears in 3 separate testimonies. Elizabeth does not write about the questioning. She writes instead about the doll. She says people want someone to carry their fear for them. Elizabeth records. She says that is how it always begins. Agnes was taken at dawn. Elizabeth's diary contains a gap of several days at this point. Pages torn out cleanly. When the writing resumes, it is cramped, the lines crowded together as though the margins no longer offer safety. They took her because she would not stop remembering. Elizabeth writes, "She told me not to forget." The trial was brief. Witnesses spoke of strange objects, of unease, of children who knew too much. No one mentioned Elizabeth by name. No one mentioned the doll. Agnes did not defend herself. According to the clerk's account, she listened as others spoke, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the assembled crowd. When asked to confess, she said, "I only returned what was given." That answer satisfied no one. Agnes Fell was sentenced to death by fire. Elizabeth writes of the day in fragments. The sky, the smell, the way the doll was heavier than usual. She did not want to go. Elizabeth writes, not because she was afraid, because she had been there before. The execution took place beyond the boundary stones, where the village ended and the land no longer belonged to anyone in particular. Agnes was bound without resistance. The fire was lit. The witnesses dispersed quickly once it was done. There is no record of Agnes's body being buried. Officially, it was consumed. Unofficially, no one searched too closely. Elizabeth's final mention of Agnes is written weeks later. She said, "I would not be alone." Elizabeth writes, she said she would stay. Elizabeth does not specify who said this. She did not need to. The quiet one learns the house. After Agnes Fell was gone, the village behaved as though something had been resolved. The path to the woods was avoided more deliberately now, but with less anxiety. People spoke her name rarely, and when they did, it was with the brittle confidence of those who believe a problem has been dealt with, simply because it has been removed from sight. Inside the Haraway house, nothing felt resolved at all. Elizabeth's writing changes almost immediately after the execution. The careful observations of earlier entries give way to longer passages. Written late at night, the ink uneven as though her hand shook or the light had been poor. She begins to write less about the doll as an object and more about the space it occupies. She likes the house. Elizabeth notes, she says it fits her better than the other places. At first, the changes are subtle. The doll is no longer carried everywhere. Instead, it is left sitting in certain rooms, positioned deliberately, on a chair near the hearth, on the chest at the foot of Elizabeth's bed, at the turn of the stairs, where one floor becomes another. Martha notices this before anyone else. In a letter written to her sister but never sent, she describes the growing sense that the house is being arranged around something she cannot see. I move her from the table, and later she is near the door. I move her from the door, and she is watching the stairs. It is as though the house is learning where she belongs. Martha attempts Briefly, to assert control, she places the doll in a cupboard and closes the door. In the morning, the cupboard stands open, the hinges creaking softly with the change in temperature. As though they had been used recently, the doll sits in the center of the kitchen floor. Elizabeth does not describe this moment directly. Instead, she writes, she does not like being shut away. She says doors make people forget what is on the other side. Samuel's response is anger, sharp and sudden. He insists the doll be kept out of sight. He tells Elizabeth she is too old for toys. He raises his voice in a way the diary suggests is unfamiliar. That night, Elizabeth writes only one sentence. She does not like it when father shouts. The house itself begins to feel altered. Not physically, there are no descriptions of warped walls or shifting rooms, but perceptually. Martha writes of footsteps she cannot place, of sounds that stop when she turns her head, of the sense that something has already passed through a room moments before she enters it. Elizabeth, meanwhile, writes with increasing certainty. She knows where everyone is. She notes even when they are quiet. The doll develops preferences. It should not face the mirror in the upper room. It should not be left near the cellar door. It prefers to be positioned where it can observe transitions, windows, thresholds, stairwells. She says she is learning. Elizabeth writes. She says houses have habits. Samuel begins sleeping poorly. His letters, brief and unsent, speak of dreams in which the walls lean inward, of waking to the sound of wood settling and feeling watched by something that does not blink. In one letter, he writes, "It is only a thing. It is only wood, and yet the house feels fuller than it did before." The tension reaches a small but telling peak one evening when Samuel trips on the stairs. He does not fall, but stumbles hard enough to bruise his knee. At the bottom of the stairs sits the doll, positioned neatly against the wall. No one admits to placing it there. Elizabeth writes about the incident with careful neutrality. She did not mean to make him fall, she writes. She says the stairs are narrow. That praising did not mean to appear nowhere else in the diary until this point. Martha begins to pray aloud more often. She sprinkles salt along the windowsills. She places a small wooden cross above Elizabeth's bed. Elizabeth does not comment on these actions, but the next morning, the cross is found lying flat on the floor, the cord cleanly cut. She does not like marks, Elizabeth writes. She says they change what a room remembers. The doll is heavier now. Elizabeth mentions this repeatedly, as if testing the idea through repetition. She is heavier when she has been awake, she writes. She rests better when everyone else is sleeping. By early spring, Samuel starts avoiding the house. He lingers at neighbors' homes. He volunteers for work beyond the village. When he returns, he avoids certain rooms, favoring the chair near the door where he can see both the stairs and the hearth. Elizabeth notices. He sits where she can see him. She writes. She says, "He's learning." The final incident before Samuel's disappearance is recorded in 3 separate accounts, each incomplete on its own. Martha writes of waking to a sound like wood, tapping against wood. She searches the house, finding nothing disturbed, until she reaches the lower stair. There, she finds the doll positioned 1 step higher than before, its head tilted slightly upward. Elizabeth writes of being woken by the sound of her father speaking softly in the dark. Not to her, not to her mother. She says he was asking where he should stand. Elizabeth writes. She told him. Samuel writes nothing after that night. The next morning, his boots are gone from their place by the door. His coat remains, The chair near the entrance is overturned, as though struck or abandoned in haste. There are marks on the floor, shallow and irregular, as if something heavy had been dragged or leaned upon for too long. The doll is found at the top of the stairs. She says the house knows him now. Elizabeth writes. She says he will not get lost. Samuel Haraway is never mentioned again in the diary. Not as missing, not as dead, not at all. The child who was no longer alone. After Samuel Haraway vanished, the house entered a period of uneasy stillness, the kind that follows an argument no one believes has truly ended. Nothing was said aloud, not by Martha, not by Elizabeth, and certainly not by the neighbors who came briefly, stood in doorways, and left again with more questions than they brought. There was no search. This fact is difficult to accept at first, and I resisted it when I encountered it in the records. A man disappears from a small village, leaving behind his coat, his work tools, and no clear destination. By any reasonable standard, there should have been urgency. Instead, there was only resignation. Martha told those who asked that Samuel had gone to seek work elsewhere. She said it firmly, as though repetition might make it true. No one pressed her. People in St. Albans had learned, by then, that answers could be dangerous. Elizabeth writes of her father's absence with a detachment that feels practiced. He is quieter now, she notes. The house does not have to make room for him. That sentence appears once, and is never explained. What follows in the diary is not grief, nor confusion, but adjustment. Elizabeth begins to describe her days as if they have simplified. There are fewer conflicts, fewer raised voices. The house, she suggests, has become easier to move through. She knows where everyone should be, Elizabeth writes, so no one gets in the way. The doll is mentioned more frequently now, but less descriptively. Its physical details recede, replaced by its influence. Elizabeth writes of guidance, of correction, of being reminded when she forgets things. She helps me remember how to stand, she notes. She says, I used to know. Martha's letters, in contrast, grow increasingly fragmented. She writes of exhaustion, of a sense that time inside the house no longer behaves as it should. She complains of mornings that arrive too soon and evenings that never seem to finish settling. In one letter, she writes, Elizabeth watches me as though she is waiting for something. When I ask her why, she says I am not standing where I belong. This observation is followed by a blot of ink, heavy enough to tear the page. The neighbors notice changes in Elizabeth as well. She becomes quieter, but not withdrawn. Instead, she listens with an attentiveness that unsettles adults, unused to being observed by children. She finishes sentences for people. She anticipates needs before they are spoken. She is helpful, one woman says, according to a later account. Too helpful. Elizabeth stops sleeping in her bed. This detail emerges slowly, pieced together from Martha's letters and the diary entries themselves. At first, Elizabeth merely mentions waking in different rooms. Then she begins to write as though location is flexible, as though where she rests is a matter of preference rather than habit. She likes it when I sleep near the stairs, Elizabeth writes. She says, it is easier to hear the house breathing there. Martha objects to this arrangement. She insists Elizabeth return to her room. She locks the door one night, believing, perhaps, that a boundary clearly defined will restore some sense of order. In the morning, Elizabeth is gone from the room. She is found sitting on the lower stair, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The doll rests beside her, positioned to face the door. Elizabeth does not react when her mother calls her name. She was listening, Martha writes later. I should not have interrupted. From that point on, Elizabeth is rarely corrected. Martha grows thinner. Her prayers become erratic, sometimes whispered too quickly to be understood, sometimes abandoned halfway through as though the words themselves have resisted completion. She complains of feeling unnecessary, of being in the way. Elizabeth responds to these complaints with a calm that feels rehearsed. She says Mother is tired because she has not learned yet, Elizabeth writes. She says it takes time. The doll begins to be referred to less as she and more as we. This shift is subtle, but unmistakable. Elizabeth writes sentences that blur responsibility, that dissolve the boundary between instruction and obedience. We do not like the mirror upstairs. We have moved the chair so it fits better. We remember when the door was wider. The last of these is underlined twice. Martha attempts, once more, to remove the doll from the house. She wraps it in cloth, ties it with twine, and places it beneath the floorboards in the small storage space near the hearth. She writes of feeling foolish, even cruel, as she does so. That night, she dreams of hands pressing upward from beneath the floor, testing the boards for weakness. In the morning, the cloth lies unwrapped beside the hearth. The twine has been neatly cut. The doll sits on the table, facing Martha's chair. Elizabeth does not comment on this directly. She writes instead, she does not like being under things. She says it reminds her of waiting. After this, Martha's resistance falters. She stops attempting to control where Elizabeth goes, where she sleeps, how she spends her time. She avoids certain rooms without consciously deciding to do so. She begins to sit where she is told, when she is told. Elizabeth writes approvingly of these changes. She is learning, she notes. She will not have to be afraid much longer. The house itself seems to participate in this education. Doors that once stuck now open easily. Floorboards creak less. The sounds of settling would diminish, replaced by a sense of held breath. Elizabeth writes of the house as though it is a living thing, responsive and attentive. She listens better now that there are fewer voices, she explains. The neighbors stop visiting altogether. When they do see Elizabeth, it is often standing in doorways, watching them pass. She does not wave. She does not smile. She simply observes, her head tilted slightly, as though assessing how they fit into the space around her. One neighbor later claims that Elizabeth's eyes seemed darker, not in color, but in focus, as though they reflected less light than before. Martha's final letter is unfinished. It begins with an apology. To whom? It is unclear. She writes of being tired, of feeling as though she has forgotten something important and cannot remember what it is. She mentions Elizabeth only once. She says, I will not be alone. She says, the house will keep me. The letter ends there. Elizabeth's diary continues. She is resting now, Elizabeth writes. She says it is easier when people stop trying to leave. After this entry, the handwriting changes again. It grows steadier, more deliberate. The lines straighten. The margins are respected. We are ready. The diary records. The house remembers us. There are no further entries. What became of Martha Haraway is never stated explicitly in any surviving document. She is not recorded as dead. She is not recorded as missing. Like Samuel, she simply ceases to be mentioned. The house, however, is remembered. Later records describe it as sealed, not abandoned, but closed, as though access itself had been deemed inappropriate. No inventory of its contents survives. No explanation is offered. Elizabeth Haraway is not seen again, but her handwriting appears elsewhere. Years later, in other places. Always careful, always listening. The day Samuel Haraway did not return. There is a temptation, when reading old diaries, to assume that the most terrible moments announce themselves properly, that there is a raised voice, a shattered object, a line of ink pressed so hard it nearly tears the page. But Elizabeth Haraway's account of her father's disappearance does none of these things. It is written calmly, almost politely, and that calmness has troubled me more than any scream could have. Samuel Haraway left the house early that morning. Elizabeth notes the sound of his boots on the threshold, the way he paused to tighten a loose strap before stepping into the mist. These details matter because they suggest intention, a man who plans to return. Martha was already awake. She stood by the hearth, her hands folded in front of her apron, watching him as though memorizing the shape of his back. Elizabeth writes that her mother did not kiss him goodbye, which was unusual, but not unheard of. Instead, Martha said only, "Mind the path," as if the path itself were capable of betrayal. Samuel answered with a half-smile. "It hasn't moved in years," he said. Elizabeth records this line carefully, underlining the word "moved" twice. The purpose of Samuel's walk is unclear. In one letter, Martha claims he went to speak with a neighbor about a fence line. In another, written weeks later, she insists he had business near the old boundary stones. Elizabeth herself does not seem to know, or perhaps she knew and chose not to write it down. What she does write is this: "He told me to keep her quiet until he came back." There is no clarification of who her is. Nona is nadeid. The morning passed without incident. Elizabeth practiced her letters. Martha worked in the garden, her movements repetitive, almost ritualistic. The doll sat where it always did, near the window, its face turned slightly away from the light. Elizabeth says she spoke to it once, asking whether it thought her father would be home before supper. The answer, if there was one, is not recorded. By midday, the mist had lifted. The road beyond the house lay bare and empty. Elizabeth writes that she watched it longer than usual, counting the spaces between fence posts, inventing patterns to pass the time. Each pattern ended the same way, with no figure appearing at the far end. Martha noticed this. "You'll wear a hole in the world if you stare like that," she said, attempting a smile that did not reach her eyes. Elizabeth does not describe fear at this point. Only discomfort, a sense that something expected had been delayed, and that the delay itself was beginning to stretch unnaturally. When Samuel did not return by late afternoon, Martha sent Elizabeth to fetch water from the pump. This detail appears insignificant until one considers that Martha never let her daughter go alone that far. Not since the winter, when voices were heard near the woods. Not since Agnes Fell was taken. Elizabeth writes that she carried the pail carefully, listening for footsteps that did not come. The village felt thinner than usual, as though pieces of it had been removed without anyone noticing. At the pump, she saw no one. On the way back, she thought she heard her father's voice behind her, calling her name softly. But when she turned, there was only the sound of the pail knocking against her leg. She did not mention this to her mother. At dusk, Martha lit a candle and placed it in the window. Elizabeth had never seen her do that before. The flame wavered even though the air was still, and the glass reflected their faces back at them, pale and doubled. The doll had been moved. Elizabeth is precise about this. She insists she did not touch it. Martha denied doing so as well. Yet there it was, no longer near the window but seated at the table, in Samuel's place. Its wooden hands rested on the surface, arranged neatly, as if someone had taken time to make them look that way. Martha said nothing. She took the doll and returned it to its usual position without ceremony, her movements stiff, almost angry. Elizabeth notes that her mother's hand shook afterward, and that she wiped them on her apron repeatedly, as though they were dirty. Night came fully. Samuel did not. Elizabeth described supper as a quiet affair. Too quiet. The sounds of chewing and swallowing seemed too loud in the absence of any other noise. Martha did not pray before the meal. That omission, small as it may seem, appears several times in Elizabeth's writing, underlined and circled, as though she did not trust herself to remember it later. After supper, Martha went outside with a lantern. Elizabeth watched her from the doorway until the light became a distant, unsteady star among the trees. She writes that the doll's head turned slightly as Martha left. This is the first time Elizabeth records movement. She does not describe it as sudden or dramatic, only that when she looked again, the angle of the face had changed, just enough to suggest attention. Elizabeth stood very still then, afraid that any movement on her part might encourage further change. When Martha returned, her boots were muddy, and the hem of her dress was torn. She would not meet Elizabeth's eyes. He must have stopped somewhere, she said, too quickly. Men do that. Elizabeth writes that she nodded, though she did not believe it. Not because she suspected something unnatural, but because her father did not stop places without reason. He was a man who finished what he began. They went to bed without extinguishing the candle in the window. Elizabeth did not sleep. She listened to the house settle, to the small noises that came with age and wood and wind. At some point in the night, she heard footsteps inside the house, slow ones, measured. She thought at first that her father had returned and was moving carefully so as not to wake them. She almost called out. What stopped her was the sound of wood against wood, a faint tapping that did not belong to boots or floorboards. It reminded her of the way toys sound when dropped gently, deliberately, as if placed rather than fallen. In the morning, Samuel Haraway was still gone. Martha went to the village. Elizabeth stayed behind. She was told to mind the house and not to open the door for anyone. Elizabeth obeyed. She always did. She writes that the doll sat closer to her than usual that day. Not touching, just nearer. When Martha returned, her face looked older. She told Elizabeth that no one had seen Samuel, not on the road, not near the boundary stones, not in the woods. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken ground. It's as if he stepped out of himself, Martha said, and then pressed her lips together hard, as though she had said too much. That night, Elizabeth found a new entry written in her diary. It was not in her hand, the hand that was not hers. There is a moment when working with private writings, when you become aware that you are no longer simply reading. You are being addressed, not directly, not intentionally, but through a narrowing of distance that should not exist between the living and the dead. Elizabeth Haraway's diary reached that moment after her father disappeared. Before that, her writing had been orderly, childlike, yes, but disciplined. Dates were precise. Sentences ended where they were meant to end. Even her mistakes followed patterns. You could feel the presence of a household that valued repetition, that trusted routine to keep the world from shifting too much. That trust does not survive Samuel Haraway's absence. The first entry after the night he failed to return is not dated. This is not an omission in the careless sense. The space where the date should be shows signs of effort. The paper there is thinner, worn by pressure, as though numbers were written, erased, and then pressed over again until the surface weakened. I noticed this only when the light caught it at an angle. The handwriting appears, initially, to be Elizabeth's. I say this cautiously. The slant is right, the proportions are familiar. Certain habits remain the way she closes her A, the narrow tail on her Y. But the steadiness is new. Her earlier entries wander slightly, rising and falling with thought and distraction. This entry does not wander. It advances. I waited. It begins. I stayed where I was meant to stay. Waiting had always been part of Elizabeth's world. She waited for meals, for prayers to end, for permission. This waiting feels different. It carries instruction within it, though no voice is named. A sentence follows, then is crossed out with a single, careful line. I spoke when she asked me to. Beneath it, written smaller and pressed tightly between the lines, is the correction. I am better when I do not answer. Silence, until now, had never been described by Elizabeth as a virtue. It had been something imposed. Here, it is chosen. The margins of the page are filled with marks that at first seem idle. Short curves, partial shapes, repetitions without clear intent. Only after several readings did I realize they are all attempts at the same form. Abandoned midway through, an oval. Again and again. Never completed. The entries that follow resist ordering. Elizabeth abandons her habit of daily record. Some pages contain several fragments separated by hours. Others hold nothing but a single sentence, written with such force that the ink bleeds through and stains the page beneath. She was closer today. No name. No explanation. Elizabeth had once named everything. People, objects, feelings. Now, names are avoided, as though they carry weight she does not wish to lift. Martha Haraway begins to recede from the diary. When she appears, it is indirectly. Elizabeth writes of meals left untouched, of doors left open long after they should have been closed. She notes her mother standing in doorways without crossing them, as though unsure which room she belonged to. Once, Elizabeth records hearing her mother say Samuel's name aloud and then stop abruptly, mid-syllable, as if corrected by someone else. The house itself begins to feel altered. Elizabeth writes of cups that feel heavier than before, though they are empty, of chairs that no longer creak, of floorboards that fail to answer weight the way they once did. These observations are not framed as fear. They are written with a quiet curiosity, as though the rules have changed and she is learning the new ones. It is quieter when I let her listen. One entry reads, the sentence appears again 2 pages later. Identical some pressure. Same ink. I examined both closely. They were written at different times. There is a longer passage that marks a clear shift in Elizabeth's thinking. I tried to remember Father how he was before, but the remembering would not stay still. His face would not keep its place. When I closed my eyes, there was wood where there should have been skin, and lines where there should have been warmth. I think remembering is harder when someone else is already holding the shape. This kind of abstraction does not appear anywhere in her earlier writing. Elizabeth had been literal to the point of bluntness. This is not imagination. It reads like explanation, as though she is reasoning through something already decided. At several points, the diary seems to argue with itself. Do not write this. One line commands. The line beneath it continues anyway. The doll becomes central without ever being named. Elizabeth stops describing it unless its position changes, and even then, the description is minimal. She was waiting when I came back. She does not like the fire. She remembers things I have not been told. There is no fear in these lines. There is relief, as though responsibility has been quietly transferred. Martha attempts to reassert control once. Elizabeth records her mother wrapping the doll in cloth and placing it in the cupboard near the hearth. The following entry is written in a darker ink, thicker and slower. She does not belong there. No subject. No justification. After this, Martha appears only once more. She said we must forget what was made. The page ends there. Several pages are missing from the diary, removed cleanly, not torn. The binding shows signs of being opened and closed repeatedly, as though someone returned more than once, uncertain how much should be taken. When the diary resumes, the handwriting has changed. It is still careful, still legible, but the small imperfections that once made Elizabeth's hand human are gone. The letters are uniform, the margins exact, the lines neither rise nor fall. I am being very good. The entry reads, I am staying where I belong, veritatis, she does not say. The final entry I will address here is the most unsettling, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it assumes. It is easier now that I do not have to remember which one of us came first. There is no signature, no farewell. Only at the bottom of the page, pressed so lightly, it nearly escapes notice, the same unfinished oval appears once more. What? The fire refused to take. There's a common belief, especially in older rural records, that fire is final, that it resolves what cannot be reasoned with, cleans what cannot be named. Martha Haraway seems to have believed this, though Elizabeth never writes it outright. Instead, the belief appears in actions taken without explanation, in decisions made too quickly and then defended with silence. The idea of burning the doll does not enter the diary suddenly. It grows piece by piece, like a thought Martha herself may not have wanted to complete. Elizabeth first mentions the fire in passing. Mother stayed near the hearth. All morning, she writes. She did not sit. This is unusual enough for Elizabeth to record. Her mother, despite her restlessness since Samuel's disappearance, had rarely lingered in one place. The hearth, until then, had been avoided. Elizabeth had written more than once that the doll did not like the fire, though she never explained how she knew this. Later that same day, Elizabeth adds a second note. She asked me where she was. The question is not specified. The answer is not given. That evening, the doll is moved again. This time, Elizabeth admits to seeing it happen. Martha takes it from the window and wraps it in cloth. Not gently. The cloth is wound tightly, layers pulled snug as if to prevent something from slipping free. Elizabeth describes her mother's hands as red, her fingers stiff, clumsy with urgency. You don't look at it, Martha says. Do you hear me? Elizabeth does not record her response, only that she obeyed. The diary grows erratic here. Lines trail off, words are cramped together, then suddenly spread wide, as though written by someone unfamiliar with the page. They go into the woods. This detail appears without context, but it is repeated. Twice. 3 times. Each repetition is identical. The fire is built near the old boundary stones. Elizabeth does not describe the stones themselves, though she has mentioned them before. She focuses instead on the sound of the wood being stacked, the way branches scrape against one another, the smell of resin when the first spark catches. She told me not to watch, Elizabeth writes. She said it was not meant for me. But Elizabeth watched. Martha throws the doll into the fire wrapped as it is. There is no hesitation, no prayer. The cloth blackens quickly. The smell is sharp, unpleasant. Elizabeth notes it carefully, as though afraid she might forget. What happens next is described strangely, indirectly. Elizabeth does not write that the doll burned. She writes that the fire changed. The flames leaned away, she says, like something breathing back. This is the first time Elizabeth assigns intention to the fire itself. Martha stirs the blaze with a stick, her movements frantic now. The cloth burns away, leaving the shape beneath. Elizabeth does not describe it. Instead, she writes about sound. There is a cracking noise, but not the kind wood makes when it breaks. She compares it to joints being worked slowly, deliberately. The fire does not grow. This is important. Elizabeth notes it. Twice, despite more wood being added, despite the careful tending, the flames refuse to strengthen. They remain low, constrained, as though limited by something unseen. She is still there, Elizabeth writes. Martha steps back. Elizabeth describes her mother's face at this moment in detail. The lines around her mouth pulled tight. Her eyes fixed not on the fire, but on the ground just beyond it, as though expecting something to appear there instead. Say it, Martha whispers. Say it is done. Elizabeth does not say who she is speaking to. The fire eventually dies. When Martha approaches the ashes, there is less than there should be. Not unburned remains, but absence, space where something had been. Elizabeth writes that her mother stared for a long time, then dropped the stick she was holding, as though it no longer served any purpose. They return home in silence. That night, Elizabeth does not sleep. She listens to her mother moving through the house, opening cupboards, closing them again. At one point, she hears Martha crying softly, repeating a phrase Elizabeth does not understand. The next morning, the doll is back. Elizabeth does not write where she finds it. She only writes that it is there, seated where it had always been, its position unchanged. There are no marks from the fire, no scent of smoke. She is colder, Elizabeth notes, but she is not gone. Martha sees it too. Elizabeth records her mother standing very still in the doorway, her mouth open as if to speak, then closing it again. She turns away without touching the doll. After this, Martha stops speaking about what happened in the woods. She stops speaking about Samuel. The diary changes again. Elizabeth begins to write shorter entries, often repeating the same sentence in different places. It does not work. Appears 3 times on 3 separate pages. Once, Elizabeth writes, "Fire only takes what is finished." This line is underlined. In a later entry, written in a heavier hand, she adds, "She was not finished. Elizabeth stops attending church shortly after this. She does not explain why. Martha goes alone. When she returns, she smells of smoke and cold air, though there is no fire lit in the house. The doll remains. Elizabeth's relationship with it changes subtly. She no longer asks questions. Instead, she writes as though listening. She says waiting is easier now. She says we are almost ready. Ready for what is never specified. The final entry of this section is brief. We tried to burn what was already remembering. The page ends there. The house that learned to keep quiet. What follows after the failed burning is not marked in Elizabeth Haraway's diary as a turning point. There is no declaration, no sentence that announces a change. Instead, the writing thins, stretches, and grows cautious, as if the house itself had begun to dictate what could safely be remembered. The first thing Elizabeth notices is the silence, not the absence of sound. The house still breathes, still settles, still answers the wind, but the absence of comment. Martha stops, remarking on small things. She no longer corrects Elizabeth's posture at the table. She does not remind her to wash her hands before supper. These habits had once been constant, almost ritual. Their disappearance unsettles Elizabeth more than any argument would have. She watches the door. Elizabeth writes, even when there is no one there. Martha begins to sleep in her clothes. Elizabeth does not speculate why. She only records that her mother's boots are always nearby now, positioned carefully beside the bed, toes pointing outward, as though ready for departure. Yet she never leaves. The village reacts quietly. Elizabeth notes neighbors who stop meeting her eyes, voices that lower when she passes. A woman who once pressed apples into her hands now turns away without speaking. None of this is described as cruelty. It is presented as adjustment, as though the village were collectively learning a new arrangement of space. They leave room for us, Elizabeth writes. Like for the sick, Samuel Haraway is not mentioned. Not by name. Elizabeth does not write that her father is dead. She does not write that he is gone. Instead, she writes around him, leaving absences where he should be. An extra chair at the table that no one moves. A coat still hanging by the door. A place in the bed that remains untouched. Once, she writes, Mother says he will not need his things again. The sentence is underlined. The house itself begins to feel unfamiliar in more deliberate ways. Elizabeth describes doors that do not stay open unless held. Windows that reflect the room too clearly, as though refusing to show what lies beyond. She writes of the sense that certain spaces have grown smaller, compressed, while others have expanded without reason. The attic is mentioned for the first time here. I went up today, Elizabeth writes. She said I could. There is no description of who she is, nor of how permission was granted. Elizabeth's account of the attic is careful, restrained. She does not describe objects in detail. Instead, she focuses on sensation, the thickness of the air, the way sound behaves differently there, dull and close. She writes that the floorboards feel warmer beneath her feet, though there is no fire nearby. She likes it there, Elizabeth notes. It remembers better. This is the first time Elizabeth uses the word remember as a property of place. Martha does not go into the attic. Elizabeth records that her mother stops at the foot of the ladder and looks up without speaking, her hand gripping the side rail so tightly that her knuckles whiten. Once, Elizabeth hears her whisper Samuel's name again, not as a call but as a warning. The doll is not described entering the attic. It is simply understood to be there. After this, Elizabeth begins to spend more time alone. Not neglected, Martha is still present, still attentive in her own way, but something in her has withdrawn. Elizabeth describes her mother as hollowed, as though parts of her have been carefully removed to make space for something else. She is quieter when she does not fight it, Elizabeth writes. And then, several lines later, adds, "I think I am too." The diarist's tone shifts again. Elizabeth's sentences grow shorter, declarative, observational. Emotion is not absent, but it is flattened, pressed thin. She does not like the church bells. They make her restless. They sound like calling. Elizabeth stops attending church entirely. Martha does not object. She goes alone, returning later than before, her face drawn, her eyes unfocused. Elizabeth writes that her mother smells faintly of old wood when she returns. Though there are no trees near the church, the village grows distant. Elizabeth notes houses shuttered earlier than usual, paths avoided, the sense that St. Albans is folding inward, becoming smaller by shared agreement. They know, Elizabeth writes. They just don't say it. One night, Elizabeth wakes to movement in the house. Not footsteps, not voices. Rearrangement. She describes the sound of wood sliding against wood, of objects being placed carefully, deliberately. She does not leave her bed. She writes later that she knew she would not be stopped if she did, and that frightened her more than the idea of being caught. In the morning, the house has changed. Furniture has been moved. Not randomly, but thoughtfully. The table is closer to the hearth. The chairs are aligned differently. Samuel's chair is gone. Elizabeth does not comment on its absence. Martha note, Elizabeth records her mother standing in the doorway for a long time, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She reaches for the place where the chair should be, then lets her hand fall. She said nothing, Elizabeth writes. That was worse. After this, Martha begins to forget things, small things at first. Words, names, the order of tasks. Elizabeth writes that her mother once asked her how old she was, then apologized immediately, pressing her hands to her face as though in pain. She said it is hard to keep what belongs to you, Elizabeth records, when something else is helping. The doll is no longer described as stationary. Elizabeth writes of finding it in different rooms without surprise, near the stairs, by the door, once at the foot of Martha's bed. She sits where she is needed, Elizabeth explains, as though this settles the matter. Elizabeth begins to write sentences that feel less like record and more like reassurance. She says, it will be easier soon. She says, mother is tired. She says houses forget people all the time. The final pages of this section are sparse. Elizabeth stops mentioning days altogether. Time becomes vague, fluid. She says, we are nearly ready to stay. She says it is better when no one leaves. The last complete entry reads, the house is learning us. The sentence beneath it is unfinished. We will not. The page ends there. After this, the diary contains only blank paper. No tearing, no damage. Just silent. The present tense of old things. It was only after Elizabeth Haraway's diary fell silent that I began to notice the tone of my own notes changing. This is difficult to explain without sounding indulgent, so I will state it plainly. The absence left by the diary did not feel like an ending. It felt like a hand paused above the page, waiting. St. Albans does not exist on any modern map. Even in the 18th century, it occupied a strange position, appearing in some parish records and vanishing from others. There are years where it is carefully accounted for births, tithes, repairs to the road, and then stretches, where the village seems to dissolve entirely, as though everyone agreed not to write its name down. The Haraway house appears in no document after that final blank page. No sale, no inheritance, no record of fire or collapse. It simply ceases to be mentioned. At first, I assumed this was administrative failure. Records are lost. Ink fades. Clacks? But the pattern is too consistent. St. Albans does not decline. It does not empty. It does not suffer plague or famine. It stops being observed. The last indirect reference appears in a tax ledger dated 17 years after Samuel Haraway's disappearance. A marginal note, written by a different hand, reads only, "Property unclaimed. Structure unsound. Nothing more." I visited the area in late autumn, long after I had convinced myself that the work was nearly finished. The road that once led to St. Albans now bends away before it reaches where the village should be. Trees crowd close on either side, their roots breaking through what remains of the old stone markers. It is not difficult to miss the place entirely. What remains of the Haraway house is little more than a suggestion. 2 walls, part of a foundation, the outline of a hearth, blackened long ago. There is no attic anymore, not in any structural sense, but the slope of the remaining beams implies one once existed. Standing there, I found myself unwilling to step fully into the space, as though the ground itself had learned a boundary I could not see. There is a quiet there that does not belong to nature. Birds avoid it. Wind moves strangely around the stones, slipping rather than passing through. Even sound behaves differently. My own footsteps felt intrusive, out of proportion, as though I were walking through a room meant to be occupied by something smaller and more careful. I did not find the door. I am aware of how that sentence sounds, as though I expected to. As though this were a story that ends with discovery. But what unsettled me most was not its absence, but the feeling that its location was already decided, and that my search had never been part of that decision. In the local records office, I found a final fragment, not a diary, not a letter, a child's slate, preserved by chance, its surface scratched and re-scratched until the marks nearly vanished. The handwriting is crude, uneven, younger than Elizabeth's had been when her diary began. There is only one sentence. She stays where she is. Remember no name, no date. The archivist who retrieved it for me laughed when I asked where it had been found. "In the wrong box," she said. "It keeps turning up in places it doesn't belong." She did not seem afraid, only tired. I returned to my notes that evening with the uneasy sense that I had overlooked something essential. Elizabeth's diary does not end with disappearance. It ends with arrival, with the house learning its occupants, with weight and resolve not by return, but by permanence. The doll does not move through people. It does not replace them. It offers something quieter, a way to stay. I have begun to notice small changes in my workspace, objects where I do not remember leaving them, the sense that certain books are heavier than they were before, though nothing has been added. Once, I caught myself turning a notebook slightly away from the window, as though light were something to be managed. These are small things, insignificant, individually. But Elizabeth wrote once that remembering becomes harder when someone else is already holding the shape. I do not know when I first began to feel that the story was no longer entirely in the past. Only that, at some point, I stopped referring to it as finished. The last note in my journal is brief. I will put this away somewhere safe. I do not remember writing it. What remains when stories are closed? There is a common mistake people make when they believe a story is finished. They imagine an ending as a sealed door, something shut cleanly and deliberately. But real endings behave more like rooms that have been abandoned too carefully, where nothing is disturbed enough to prove absence. I did not return to St. Albans again. That choice was not driven by fear, at least not the kind that announces itself clearly. It came from something more subtle, the sense that returning would change the nature of what had already been concluded. Elizabeth Harroway's account did not ask for verification. It resisted it. Instead, I focused on the periphery, the people who brushed against the story and survived intact. If survival is the correct word. There is a letter preserved in a private collection in Bath, written nearly 40 years after the Harroway house vanished from record. It is from a woman named Margaret Bell, addressed to her sister. The letter concerns ordinary matters for most of its length. A child's illness, the price of candles, a neighbor's death, until, without transition, it drifts into something else. See, she writes, I dreamed again of the small room with no windows. It is always clean. There is always something watching that does not blink. I wake with my hands folded. Though I never fall asleep that way, there is no explanation, no reference to why her sister would understand this. The letter resumes its domestic tone immediately after, as though nothing unusual has been said. Margaret Bell never lived near St. Albans, nor did her sister. That distance matters, not because it weakens the connection, but because it strengthens it. The doll, if it can still be called that, does not belong to a place. It belongs to a condition. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. Her final entries are not about fear. They are about relief. The terror comes earlier, during the struggle to resist interpretation. Once she stops asking what it wants, the language softens, the sentences lengthen. She begins to write as though addressing something that already knows her. People often assume that possession, if it occurs, is violent or abrupt. But Elizabeth's experience suggests something more intimate. A negotiation, a quiet erosion of alternatives. Samuel Harroway's fate is never described directly, but it can be inferred. He disappears at the precise moment when Elizabeth stops writing about him as separate. He becomes a concept rather than a presence. He is referred to in the past tense without ceremony, like a habit broken without noticing. In one passage she writes, "He would not have liked this, but that does not matter now. No grief follows. Only acceptance." This is where many retellings of the story falter. They search for punishment, for moral consequence. But the horror of the Harroway house lies in its lack of judgment. The doll does not reward or condemn. It simply offers continuity to those willing to surrender authorship of themselves. That is why it endures. I once showed Elizabeth's diary to a colleague, removing the names and locations. He read it slowly, then told me it was a remarkably tender account of isolation. He said the ending felt hopeful. I did not correct him. Hope is not always benevolent. The last confirmed appearance of the doll, if it can be called an appearance, comes from an estate inventory dated 1812. It lists an object described only as a small carved figure, provenance unknown, retained by request. There is no value assigned, no material specified. It is not included in the auction that followed. The estate belonged to a man who never married and left no heirs. His personal papers contain a single sentence repeated across multiple pages, written in increasingly careful script. "She keeps the quiet for me." After that, there is nothing. No chain of custody. No dramatic rediscovery. Just absence. Again and again. Punctuated by small, human acknowledgments that something has been chosen over motion. As I write this, I am aware of how carefully I arrange my words. I find myself returning to certain phrases, smoothing them, making them fit better than they need to. There is comfort in repetition. Elizabeth wrote that too, though she did not recognize it at the time. Stories like this do not end because endings imply release. They conclude by settling into the spaces where people stop asking questions. If you are listening, reading this, and feel a faint sense of recognition, not fear, but familiarity, then you understand what the Haraway house offered, a place to be remembered without being disturbed. And once that is accepted, once stillness becomes preferable to escape, the story no longer needs to follow you. It only needs to wait.